Inside America's Boardrooms, the informational show for board members and corporate secretaries. Brought to you with knowledge partners NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.
Welcome to this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. I'm TK Kerstetter, the CEO of Boardroom Resources and your host for today's show. We're going to be talking about the art of serving as a board committee chair. And joining me is someone who has had experience in this and is going to share it with us. Welcome Jim Loree, who's the chairman of the Audit Committee of Harsco Corporation, and more importantly is the president of Stanley Black Decker, Inc. Jim, welcome.
Thank you, TK.
So I think an interesting place for us to start is, so your day job, okay, obviously that takes a majority of your time, is something that you deal with your own board, and then you go and serve as a audit committee, serve on the board, and then audit committee chair of Harsco Corporation. So having that experience of serving on somebody else's board, how has that impacted how you handle and how you've developed as an executive at your own company?
Well, I think it's a great topic, and it's probably one that's somewhat underappreciated. I haven't heard a lot about this over the years, but I served as a C-level executive for over 10 years, mostly as a CFO, before even joining a public company board. And during that time frame, I had an enormous quantity of board interaction, and sometimes I just left there wondering, where they were coming from. And about 4 years ago, I was able to join the Harsco board, and I've learned so much. I think it's a very rich experience for a C-level executive. And now as the chief operating officer, I have a little bit more time on my hands. It's challenging as a CFO, but there's a couple areas that I think are particularly interesting. Communication. If you're an executive and you don't have board experience, and particularly a CFO, you feel like, well, I need to provide as much detail as I possibly can to make sure that the board members are totally up to speed. Well, as a board member, you find out that that's great in the appendix for the most part, but you just want this, you want the story, what's really going on, and if there's additional detail required, then you provide it. So that's one example. I think another one is board dynamics. You have anywhere from 9 to 15 people on a board, and some of them are very engaged and some of them aren't very engaged, and how decisions get made and the process that boards go through to make important decisions like succession and things like that, to really observe that right up close and personal, I think is a great experience. And it also provides some perspective as you sit there in the C-level seat as you observe these things from the other side. So it's a tremendous experience, and one that I'm really grateful that I've been able to have.
Yeah, it's interesting. I run into my travels to companies and to CEOs or boards that don't want to have their second level of officers that report to the CEO serve on any boards because of time. And I understand that sensitivity, to the time, because if you get on the wrong board, it can zap a lot of time. But I try and tell them that I don't think there's any better training ground for somebody than to have that experience of doing that. Would you agree?
I would totally agree, but I think it also has to be manageable from a time perspective, and schedules, that have to be just aligned perfectly so that you don't end up with conflicts. And in a conflict, if you're an executive, your company wins in a conflict, and that's an important consideration too.
Yeah, well, I can see, and especially for CFO, general counsel, those would be tough conflicts and happen more often than not, I would think. Yeah. So let's make a switch. Let's talk a little bit about the audit committee. And, again, you've seen it both from the employee side and from the board side, but what do you see as sort of the biggest challenges that face audit committees when we look into the near future?
Well, I think the biggest challenges, number 1, number 2, and number 3 are all the same, and that is bandwidth. If you think back to 10 plus years ago when the audit committee was fairly straightforward, and this was pre-Sarbanes and so forth, and pre-New York Stock Exchange regulations and some of the other regulations that have evolved over time. You've had a tremendous amount of work pile up related to all the compliance with these types of regulations, and so I'll call it check the box kinds of things. And then at the same time, enterprise risk management has really come into the fold as being incredibly important and a big responsibility of the board, and generally falls in the lap of the audit committee, at least the processing part of it, and then of course the overall board opines on it and so forth. And then most recently, the latest development is the role of cybersecurity and the importance of protecting the company's assets as it relates to cybersecurity. Now that topic is one where we really are just beginning to scratch the surface, and there's not too many subject matter experts on most boards that really can contribute to cybersecurity. So there's a tremendous amount of learning that has to occur at the board level and at the management level. So to absorb all of those changes, what's really happening is the workload is increasing dramatically, and something has to give. So either we have to move some responsibilities to other committees, and in fact at Harsco, that's what we've done recently, is we've moved the enterprise risk management over to the Nom and Gov committee, which has a little more bandwidth. So that's one option. We've also extended the time that we meet as an audit committee so that we have the opportunity to cover some of these topics in more detail. And then the third thing we've tried to do is to get some of the rote sort of non-value added activity out of the system, and where you're simply checking the boxes, and to try to find ways to do that in a more time efficient manner.
Yeah, there's no question that those are all subjects that I'm going to have to dig into in future shows. The enterprise risk management, where it belongs, how it's evolving. Cyber risk is just, I mean, if you aren't paying a lot of attention to cyber risk, you're just making a huge mistake as a board, and you're right, the learning curve on that is just enormous. And I'm not sure that it's necessarily solved by hiring a CIO or a CTO, onto that. Yeah. If it was that easy, that would be great, but I'm not sure that it is. But there's another thing that we've talked about in future shows that I wanted to ask you about, and that is this concept today. So much happens in the board committee, so much happens in the audit committee. You've served as the chair of the audit committee for 3 years. So to me, that's the minimum that somebody should serve. So nobody should rotate outside of that, outside of 3 years, because I think you're just starting to get into the flow, learn the job, really providing good value to the company that you serve on the board of. But at some point in time, there's logical, whether that's 5 years, whether that's, I don't think anybody should serve more than 7 years, but at some point in time, you're going to need to be replaced. How do you go about in today's world thinking, because you serve on the Nom-Gov committee as well, so how do you go about thinking, how do I replace, this job going forward, and how do I recruit somebody or people to know that we've got people to slot into all those positions?
Yeah, I think there's a succession planning aspect to staffing committee chairs, and that, whether it's the comp, whether it's the audit, I think that has to be considered. Many boards have matrices where they look at skills, and when they have an opening, they try to match up, along the lines of where they have gaps in their skill sets. But I don't know how many of them actually say, how many audit chairs do we have in the pipeline? How many comp and org chairs do we have in the pipeline? I don't see that as something that gets discussed too frequently, and I think it's an area where we can definitely make some improvements across the boardrooms of America, where we actually do spend time thinking about, do we have a sufficient quantity of audit chair qualified people in the pipeline? And I found that it's been very helpful to be a long tenured CFO to be a chair of an audit committee. I think senior level ex-audit partners can be good chairs, and there's other folks, ex-CEOs can be good chairs and so on. But having that really core financial expertise is really important.
Yeah, I think, and with the challenges of comp, in the old days, there wasn't much discussion about how much you knew about comp or what happens. You were supported by your comp consultant and your HR person. But again, today, that's changed completely. And maybe the most changing committee, just like you said, the fact that you put some of the enterprise risk back on the Nom-Gov committee. But if you think about just like what you said of finding the right mix and doing stuff, that probably committee had the least respect. But now, when you look at all the responsibilities that the board members have to do, even that committee is a very critical committee to the whole process. So it's going to be interesting. I agree with you wholeheartedly. Boardroom succession is going to become as important as, maybe not as important, but close to important as CEO succession will be. So I love to ask this guest of people that are, ask this question of guests that people have come in. When you look at what's trending in the boardrooms, SEC, activist stuff, whatever, and you look at again, those trends over the past couple of years and looking in the future, as a senior executive, but more importantly as a board member, when you look at those, what concerns you about what's going on in boardrooms today? And then let me ask you the reverse, is what encourages you that you think gives you hope about how boardrooms are evolving?
Okay, well, first I'd like to just say that my first piece of advice on activism is be your own activist. I think it's the best piece of advice you could possibly have. If the management team and the board are aligned on being their own activist, then you'll do the right things that will repel the activists from getting involved. I think it's mixed results in terms of whether that's really happening. I think some companies are doing a great job, some boards are doing a great job, and in other cases there seems to be a bit of a deaf ear, if you will, to that. So that's one area. I think the other area that really is a concern, and not that it's not recognized, but in cybersecurity or with respect to cybersecurity, I think we're kind of moving too slowly as a set of companies. I think that especially the companies that don't really perceive cybersecurity to be a life-threatening risk don't have the subject matter expertise and maybe don't know how to get it. Maybe the management teams aren't quite as focused on that. The boards aren't quite as focused on that. So I see that, and as you mentioned, the learning curve is very steep, and the consequences, and in some cases, the consequences that are unknown can be very, very severe to reputation, to economics, to the lifeblood of a company. So I think the concern I have is that we need to move faster with respect to cybersecurity, and the companies that are not like the financial services companies that are highly exposed, or the consumer products companies or retail. I think other companies really need to kind of get on the bandwagon here and drive some change at a very rapid rate. So those are the concerns. I think on the optimism side, I'm excited about this whole area of engagement. I think that many board members and executives, management teams tend to view this as a threat. And I see it much more as an opportunity for us to be proactive and to get out there and listen to the people that own the companies about how they feel about compensation, how they feel about strategy, how they feel about some of these really important topics that they all have opinions on. And whether we like it or not, it's coming, and it's actually here. So we might as well figure out how to get engaged. And I think that is the big question. The big question is not whether we should or need to get engaged. The question is, how do we get engaged? And that, I think, is still in its sort of embryonic phases. But there will be a lot of progress, I believe, over the next year or two in that area. And I think the companies that take the bull by the horns with that one are going to be the ones that really fare much better. And then the last thing on the optimistic front, I see real change in the area of diversity on boards, and it's really encouraging to me, the progress that's been made in the last, it seems like about 2 years. You're starting to see much more gender diversity, race diversity, age diversity, subject matter expertise diversity, all these things that will make the governance process more effective. And there seems to be a much more openness on boards to bringing in the diversity that's required to keep the governance process healthy.
And I agree with you 100%. I think on the diversity front, Everybody I talk to, from search firms to NomGov chairs, everybody is focusing on making sure that they have, as you said, diversity of thought, diversity of gender, diversity of color, the whole works. So I think that can't help but create a better thought process within the boardroom. So Jim, Loree, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us here at our NASDAQ market site, and we appreciate your time. And that will conclude this edition of Inside America's Boardrooms. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'll be back again next week when we take a look at another critical topic that'll help you be a better board member or committee member. We'll see you then.
Join us again next week for Inside America's Boardrooms. Brought to you with Knowledge Partners, NASDAQ, the Center for Audit Quality, and PwC. Along with content contributors, Equilar, Meridian Compensation Partners, Wilson Sonsini Goodrich and Rosati, R.R. Donnelly, and the Society of Corporate Secretaries and Governance Professionals.